And powerful words, and by those words, we understand that what happened with our ancestors, the emancipation, is not something that is restricted to their descendants or other persons who shared a common heritage. It was a human tragedy, the enslavement and chattelization of the persons who were emancipated and those who came before them and did not have the opportunity to be emancipated. But it's a human matter, and therefore it concerns us all, regardless of how we identify ourselves or how the wider society has identified us within the last 5 to 600 years. So, for full transparency, nonetheless, I think I ought to tell you, as you've heard, and reiterating, I'm a lawyer by training, by practice. And I am not, as you would imagine, an accredited historian. So we may think of our conversation, of what I have to share, as storytelling. But I have to also tell you that when I engage in storytelling of this nature, it is evidence based, based on an investigation of the past by accredited historians and also an analysis of what historians have shared with us. And after all, when you think about it, what is history really? His story? Maybe her story? And we must admit that for far too long, for far too many centuries, his story has not included, in fact, has deliberately excluded my story, our collective garment of destiny, their story, the stories and the cumulative story of our ancestors whose emancipation we commemorate during this period. And what do we do about it? Those are the ancestors upon whose shoulders we've established that we rise. Their stories have been extinguished. What does that mean for us today? It means that a part of us is missing, and that part is essential. Every part of that garment is essential. We know that our ancestors were hunted, captured, transported not as human beings, but as cargo, just like rum or sugar, but they were classified as live cargo because they could breathe and they could enrich their owners, their purported owners of men, much more so than the unalive cargo. They were owned, sold on the auction block, and owned in the Americas as livestock or furniture, chattel, not even conferred with the dignity of being considered human. We know also that slavery existed for as far back as humanity existed, but this was different. Other human beings, if you are religious, you read the Bible, you read about Egypt, enslavement in Egypt, we don't get a sense that anybody was chattelized. They were human. But this was unique in that human beings were being chattelized, property, classified just like livestock. So there was no need to record their history. In, in fact, it was not just inadvertently, but deliberately, purposefully extinguished so that, presumably, they would not know their true selves. And this is an important matter for the entire human race because we must learn the lessons of history in order not to repeat them. And, as Dr. King said, any injustice is a threat to justice everywhere. So this should concern us all, the community of nations. And therefore, we should all celebrate with African Americans and the rest of the nation, not only our emancipation, but Juneteenth, which has just been commemorated on the 19th of June in the US. Now, such jollification, I've admitted that I really love that word, because it reminds me of the little dynamo, a stylish little dynamo who was my grandmother, Constance. And it reminds me also that it's an opportune moment when we engage in jollification, quite apart from that, for emancipation or Juneteenth. It's an opportune moment for reflection and recognition. Reflection. Why? My dear mother Doreen, who became an ancestor just recently, months ago, used to say that children learn what they live and children live what they learn. And I can share with you that the lesson that I learned from my mother's life is that we are the sum total of those from whom we are descended. We must honor them and we must draw wisdom from their lives and the lessons that they shared with us, whether in practice, indeed, or verbally. So we may say, why reflection again? And to that, I can share also with you that my mother ended up, in my reflection, becoming a metaphor for a principle, a West African principle from the Akan people, which I came across as a somewhat mature adult, Sankofa. Sankofa teaches us that, and I quote, we must go back to our roots to move forward. We should reach back and gather the best of what our past has to teach us so that we can reach our full potential as we move forward. Whatever we have lost, forgotten, foregone, or been stripped of can be reclaimed, revived, persevered, and perpetuated. Unquote. So, a little bit more about Sankofa. It is often depicted by, and I quote again, a mythical bird flying forward with its head turned backward. The egg in its mouth represents the gems or knowledge of the past upon which wisdom is based. Moreover, the egg also signifies the generation to come that would benefit from that wisdom. Unquote. By the way, this is why we are investing time in a history club, because we want to know that the cumulative wisdom, we want to ensure that it's passed down and to ensure that they understand the wisdom that can be drawn or extracted from the past. So, if we were to apply this principle of Sankofa to the whole context of emancipation, not just the jollification, but the entire context, we could not possibly gloss over the horrible parts and just skip to the jollification. And we should not be ashamed of the horrible parts. They are facts. Facts are obstinate things that deserve our attention. We know that untold millions, by some accounts 10,000, 10 million, 15 million, or even more Africans were hunted and captured and transported as live cargo. And then, as I mentioned, chattelized. We also should reflect on the communities in Africa from which they were stolen, because those communities were ravaged in order to capture the strongest and the fittest who could serve their purported masters of men in the most capitalistic way. Unfortunately, emancipation provided no right to our human ancestors to sue for damages or compensation. They received no apology at the time. To date, precious few apologies from the descendants of those who enslaved and colonized them. No apologies for the physical, emotional, psychological, or other harms that they experienced or endured in the Americas and on the African continent in the long marches to the coast during the perpetuation of that trade, that nefarious trade. On the contrary, we may note that the former owners, quote unquote owners, were compensated. Historians and economic historians and other social scientists tell us that it has taken almost 2 centuries for the British government alone, and that was not the only nation state involved in the trade and the enslavement and colonization, but just for the British government to repay the loans that they obtained to compensate their citizens who were formerly owners of our Guyanese ancestors, it took almost 2 centuries. That was complete only in 2015, in our time. So even after emancipation, we may note that the formerly enslaved persons could not enjoy economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights in the colony of British Guyana or elsewhere. If we fast forward to today, according to public domain information, no insider information here, the UN estimates, and you can check it for yourselves on UN websites that are publicly available, the UN estimates that over 200 million persons of African descent reside in the Americas. We were not here 1,000 years ago, but certainly I claim my native affiliation. I consider that we are native to the Americas now. We have been here for many centuries. And so there are over 200 million of us, most of whom are descended from emancipated ancestors. This includes, of course, our Guyanese ancestors who were emancipated following the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 that came into effect on the 1st of August in 1838 for our Guyanese ancestors because there was a period of what was called apprenticeship. Really not apprenticeship, because how can you be apprenticed to a job that you've been performing without being paid for your entire life, the lives of your parents, etc., but just an interim period for the planter class to acquire a new labor force. And this abolition act took effect not only in the CARICOM region, where many of us are from, but also in Canada. And I believe our beloved headmistress, Sister Hazel, has been involved in commemorations in Canada, where she now resides. Sorry to bring tales out of school, but that's a glorious one that needs to be told. And emancipation also took effect in South Africa. That may be a surprise to many, um, but the tentacles of enslavement of Africans were not limited to a specific, global region in the globe. So, reflections. And if we move on to recognition, because I promised that we would talk about recognition as well. We may say, why recognition? Because, this period is so terrible, so, just so bad. Why do we need to talk about it? Open wounds. But I guess because I'm an eternal optimist, I'm not saying that historians, accredited historians, are not, but I come to the subject, from a very individualistic perspective. And for me, it's important to recognize, to draw on that period. I can attribute it to the kind of Sankofa principle on which I was raised, even though we didn't use that term at the time. But I feel there's a lot of wisdom to be gathered and applied from that period. And I see that the community of nations, the United Nations, again, no insider dealing, no insider information. This is public domain information. And we have witnessed in our time, and I think I consider myself very privileged to be living in this time, because if I had been around 100 years ago, I would not be able to predict that there would be a United Nations organization, that member states would gather and they would approve a resolution that brought into force a decade for people of African descent that has 3 pillars. And I would also not have been able to predict 200 years ago, if I were enslaved, as our ancestors were, that there would have been, at the turn of the century, beginning of the 21st century, a world conference on racism in Durban, South Africa, which would yield a Durban Declaration and program of action, which agreed, and I quote, that slavery and the slave trade are a crime against humanity and should have always been so. It was further agreed that slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, were appalling tragedies in the history of humanity, especially in their negation of the essence of the victims. Unquote. So, these things, I believe, deserve recognition by us all. They deserve to be promoted to the broadest gathering of humanity in the global village. For me, the UN resolution and all related resolutions are a call to action, not just for me who had the privilege of a career there, but for all of us. And equally important, or perhaps more so, in March of 2026, we may have read in the news that a further resolution was proposed by Ghana and approved by the UN General Assembly, affirming that the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans was, get this one, the gravest crime against humanity. Just as I was mentioning earlier in the reflections part of our convo today, conversation today, or convo as we might say colloquially, uh, this injustice to our ancestors was the gravest crime because it chattelized our ancestors. It sought to erase their very humanity. And that had not been done before and hopefully will never be done again. So, back to recognition and the resolution for the decade, which has been followed by another decade because that one ended on the 31st of December 2024. There's now a second decade, and there's also a forum for people of African descent because of this very grave, or the gravest, according to the latest resolution, the gravest crime against humanity. So it falls to us uh, to recognize, this is the action for us, or the mandate, to recognize the essence of our Guyanese ancestors and all other victims of chattelization, the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. We should recognize their humanity and with that, their dignity, because livestock do not have the same dignity as human beings, is what we believe. And we need to recognize their humanity, their dignity, and their contributions to the development of the world. The resolution didn't say that part. This is my addition. But I think I'm persuaded that you would agree with me. Not just their contributions in the Americas, but also in the so called mother countries, the colonizing powers, because we know that there were many nationalities controlling the destiny of our ancestors. I was privileged to hear uh, the late ancestor, the distinguished Nobel laureate, Sir Derek Walcott, speak both in St. Lucia, his native St. Lucia. You see, I uphold the traditions of the ancestors. I track things like jazz festivals. And this was in a little bit of a sidebar where the Honorable, the late Sir Derek Walker spoke about a little island like St. Lucia changing hands 23 times. Can you believe this? The Pearl of the Antilles, Haiti. We know how many times, how many after they asserted their independence through the revolt, the revolution. We know how many Napoleon and many other European leaders tried to recolonize our ancestors because they were so valuable to the development of the global north. And we can think, even in Little Guyana, of how many different place names we have. This is a testimony or a testament to how many nations made their wealth in our global south from the contributions extracted from our ancestors. And I'll just indulge me a little bit because I like to talk in tongues, not the Pentecostal one, but certainly like to talk in multilingual fashion. If we think of Stabroek and Demerara, Dutch names, the Dutch were there hundreds of years in Guyana, as we know. We can also think we don't have, or we haven't raised the level of prominence of our French heritage as we know of the Dutch and the British. But think of how many place names we have, such as in our Guyanese flavor, we have maybe recolonized or reverse colonized certain uh, words such as pardon me, Versailles. You may take it on good authority that that word was introduced from a place far away from Guyana where the people might have said Versailles. And we all know Penitence Market. I am persuaded it used to be La Penitence. People from the original town would have lent their language and culture to Guyana because they were there seeking their fortune. We all know of Repentier Cemetery in good Guyanese. Here again, Le Repentier. And who doesn't know in Guyana of Plaisance? Plaisance. And I'll give you one more. Bel Air. It might have been Bel Air in the beginning. So we know how many different languages, how many different cultures came to Guyana and made their fortunes. But we also have to recognize that the story of our ancestors does not end there. It is not just about enslavement, chattelization, or colonization. It is equally, I would submit to you humbly, a wonderful story about overcomers, a story about the resilience of the human spirit, about resistance and faith, the hope of things yet unseen, about freedom and the dream. The dream, we are the dream. If we were around with the ancestors 250 years ago, we would have been thinking like Kofi, the boy, Akan boy born on a Friday. That's Kofi, called Coffee by the Dutch. But we would have been thinking of freeing ourselves so that our children could be free to assert themselves as human beings. We now know through the work of Professor Marjolein Kars, a Dutch historian, that Kofi, or Kofi, wanted to establish a capitalist republic in Guyana. It would have been the first Black republic. It would have been before the United States of America were established. This is the stuff that our ancestors were made of. And we are the manifestation of the dream of our ancestors in Guyana and throughout the Americas. So this is why I've always loved history, because growing up in a home, where there was a lot of history, I used to think back to the ancestors. I wanted to know their stories. And somehow I imagined that this is the kind of thing they thought about. And I'm so grateful that now we have access not to a lot, but to some of their human stories as told in their own words. And the mandate to us, I think, is to continue this work, this reconstruction of their history, because we are tied, as Dr. King said, to the single garment of destiny, their destiny. And if some of the threads of the garment are removed, whether inadvertently or deliberately extinguished, we must repair that garment. And we can only do so by investigating the past analytically and objectively. And when we apply the principle of Sankofa and look back, we can draw much wisdom. And if you would indulge me, I'll just share some more examples because I've thought about what their life was like. I've tried to reconstruct it. And if we can go, I see a prompt from Brenda, but I hope that you will indulge me a little bit more just to share the humanity of our ancestors, because I think this is critical. We often read about our ancestors in an exoticized way: the slaves, the blacks, the enslaved, the Africans, the free blacks. But have we ever thought about what their lives were like? They came from different parts of Africa. We know from genetics now that some of us carry uh, the genes of people taken from as far north as Senegal, the entire west coast, and also as far inland, landlocked places like Mali. They came from many places. They spoke many different languages, some from empires, some from little villages and other communities. They could not communicate with each other when they were captured and and penned together. And yet, they developed ways of communicating the drums. The drums were so important in communicating in the revolution of Saint Domingue, now known to us as Haiti or Haiti. They developed a lingua franca, which was spoken and is still spoken in many parts of the Americas, not just by the original inhabitants or speakers, but by everyone. Everyone in Guyana speaks Creolese or understands Creolese. You don't get far without it, no matter if you are trained like me to be a little bit of an English duck and you speak other languages. Creolese is the lingua franca. You will be ripped off if you go to the market speaking like an English duck. Freedom fighters. We know, I'd mentioned Kofi, we can mention General Toussaint. They wanted their human rights. They never allowed themselves to be subjugated. We just celebrated the bicentennial of the Demerara uprising. Deacon Kwamina led that with his son. So we know that Guyanese history, our history, is a world treasure. We are sitting on it. Professor Carr's book about the 1763 revolt, by the way, she sends her greetings, but she would have loved to join us, she said, but she had a prior engagement. It won the 2021 Frederick Douglass Prize for History in the US and the Cundill Prize in Canada. Our history is not a joke. It is a serious matter that tells us how humans, our ancestors, how they survived and what they thought of. And this is groundbreaking, not just an exoticized version of history, but a human version of history that gives them agency. Labor and skills, we know that they brought lots of skills. That's why they were captured. Gold mining, they also planted a version of, historians describe it as a hardy version of rice and other crops that they grew. They provided labor to tame the wild coast. Now, when we were growing up, we were told the seawall, which keeps the Atlantic off of the coastal area where most of us live in Guyana, I would glibly repeat, oh yes, the foreigners, oh yes, the Dutch built they're responsible for our seawall. But we didn't stop to think who provided the labor. According to our late and revered, my childhood hero, one of them, Dr. Walter Rodney, quoting the Veal Commission, he said that the removal of 100 million tons of soil is what was required to tame and humanize what was then known as the Wild Coast. Guyana was called the Wild Coast. Swamps below sea level, infested with all sorts of terrible vectors that could kill humans. Not just the malaria mosquitoes, but growing up in Guyana, we all know about our famous commoodies, as we call them, constrictor reptiles that can break our bones and just devour us and rest for days. So, this is the terrain that our ancestors conquered and tamed for us. We need to recognize them for that. Law and family values, marriage. We know that because they were chattelized, they were not allowed the humanity of being married. How did they get about it? Have you ever heard the term kwe and then another kwe? We associate it with jollification, lots of dancing, partying, now called twerking now that it's been exported. But our ancestors were clever. They were determined to retain their family structures in as much as they could be sold, at the drop of a hat. And so they came up with a whole tradition disguised as merrymaking. Kwe, kwe. And I've been coached by my Igbo brother from another mother who tells me my Igbo pronunciation is pretty good. But even if it isn't, you get the meaning of it. Kwe is a word that I understand is still used in Igbo land today in Nigeria, meaning agree. So, kwe, kwe. What do we have? A contract. In this case, a contract of marriage. So, this is how our ancestors got around this prohibition against marriage and were able, in their own way, to secure some sort of stability, sociological stability and spiritual stability, preserving their humanity, preserving to the extent that they could a family structure. And then there is a famous one, another one of my heroes, though he's been gone over 2 centuries ago. One of the first authentic autobiographies that I read of our ancestors was by Olaudah Equiano. He had been captured as a boy in Igbo land, enslaved, transported, enslaved, the usual stuff. But he managed to have manumission, his freedom. And he purchased his freedom and he campaigned. He was an abolitionist. And he wrote his autobiography talking about his life as he could remember it as a boy in Igbo land before he was captured. And he talked about the way of life, how the people depicted their, it was a very rich culture, and they depicted their daily life and special events with different dances and songs and that kind of thing. And this is what our ancestors did. We have folk songs. We must recognize them for giving us a Guyanese culture, in Jamaica, a Jamaican culture, and songs like Jane Engage. Jane Engage and She Think Nobody Like She tells us about the buzz of the village of the young lady getting engaged and strutting about, a little bit of naughtiness about what she might have been engaged in once she secured a fiance. But, it's telling us about the village wire running wild, very realistic about village life, morning neighbor morning, about the ancestor who went off to do pork knocking, panning for gold, got a lot of money, had a good life, and then he came back broke and tried to be friendly with his neighbors. And the neighbor says, when you been a korapong, you not been tell me morning. No, because your money done, your hustle for tell me morning. When you were enjoying your wealthy life, you had no time for me. And the neighbor says, and note the politeness of the ancestors, not calling the pork knocker conniving, but the neighbor saying, Neighbor Joe saying, I don't want your conniving, morning. I don't want your conniving. It's the morning that's conniving. That's the beauty of the Creole's language as it evolved through our ancestors. They also tackled domestic violence. Sanko liki love upon the dam and the gala hala morda. You know, they didn't call it domestic violence, but this is what they were, in a sense, recording for us. So we know how they were living, what were their values. And in Jamaica, there's a song that my Jamaican family taught me, uh, somewhat similar to Morning Neighbor Morning, about also recording their history, about the ancestor who went off to help build the Panama Canal, comes back, and pardon me, I will give a fake Jamaican accent. If we have any real Jamaican, please feel free to say the words in the most authentic Yadaman accent. But it speaks of the Colon Manacom, with them brass chain and lick him belly bam bam bam. Ask him what the time is, him look up on the sun. So that's their example of, the nouveau riche guy coming back to the village. Um, and this is how our ancestors recorded some of their history for us, not all of it. But I see that the time is going, and I got a little prompt from Brenda. And so and I also see a message from Miss Finance, who is the dynamic head of department. And so I think there's a lot more we can say about our ancestors. I'm always happy to talk about them, but I think I should see the mic and mute myself so that we may have comments, questions, especially from our young historians or from their representative, head of department, Miss Finance. So I will hand this over right now and we can have a real conversation, not just the sound of my voice. Over.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Oh boy, that was I could actually listen to more, but I know it's a matter of time. But yeah, it was really enjoyable. And I can tell you that, boy, I learned a lot, and plus things that I didn't remember came up. Um, I'll start off with I had a couple of questions for you, but I think I'll start off with the comment in the chat. It says, Hi, Miss Branch. Miss Susan Fernandez here from St. Rose's High School History Club here. Indeed, children live what they learn. However, do you know that in Guyana here at most schools, Caribbean history is only compulsory in the humanities or art stream? At St. Rose's, Caribbean history is introduced in grade 9 and is optional in the business stream, slashed with subjects like agricultural science. One main reason that students or the younger people lack knowledge of history is because they are not choosing history to study. Therefore, they cannot grasp the concepts of reparations. Even when we have the Emancipation Festival in the National Park on August 1st, every year, many young people do not go. I invited our history club of 85 students last year to the Emancipation Festival in National Park, but because school is usually closed by then, only one student came. Myself and that history club member and my children enjoyed the Emancipation Festival and sent photos to the history club WhatsApp group. I was telling Mr. Thomas we need to do some activities during emancipation time to enlighten the students. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
And actually, one of my questions I had for you was actually on those lines of how can younger members of the diaspora stay connected to their roots?
Well, I guess it's an easy one for me, and that's partly because of my mother. I mean, my dad was not a historian, but he also read a lot, so there were always books around, and my parents spoke, with great pride about people like Dr. Walter Rodney. So that's an easy part for me. But I think that even if people are not raised in households like mine, it's up to the parents to introduce, especially in the diaspora, to introduce our children to our growing up days, so to speak, to talk about Guyana, to use every opportunity, for instance, in New York during the Labor Day festivities that have now commonly come to be known as Carnival Weekend. We can find activities, I think, that speak to our heritage, to which we can introduce our children. And we can also introduce them to aspects of history in this country that may compare with our own experience. That also, I guess, is an easy thing for me because I'm in a hybrid household. I'm the only Guyanese. My spouse is American, and our son, is American. But we kind of, straddle that by introducing each other to each other's cultures, and there are many similarities. That would probably be the subject of another discussion. But I think it starts in the home. This is why I really sort of hinged what I had to say around that Sankofa principle, because we as adults, I think, have to lead the way in introducing, in sort of making it a natural part of our life, our background, and the background of other cultures, and sort of stimulate that intellectual and cultural curiosity, because it's not only about serious, pardon me, nerdy stuff. I'd be the first person to call myself a nerd, so it's not a diss or a negative thing, but it's sort of awakening that natural curiosity. But there are also fun ways to do it. There are festivals, multicultural festivals. I don't think you can walk through Central Park on a Saturday afternoon without seeing an array of cultures on display. So, I mean, that's what I would say. I've rambled on a bit, but that's what I would say. Like, incorporate it into life and fun and learning. Maybe vacations don't always have to be at a Caribbean beach or something like that, but they can incorporate some aspect of learning or in a fun way. Over.
Brenda, you're muted.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I said I was going to pass it on to Michelle Matthews. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I think I'm unmuted. Jenny, thanks so much for this presentation. It was outstanding. I just want, it's more of a comment rather than a question. I think it cannot be emphasized enough the importance of understanding our history, particularly as we right here in the United States is seeing the move of history to be removed or erased from the educational process. So I think that just following up my question, I did have a question. I think you answered it in your last comment, but I think it's extremely important that we, as the now moving into the elder stage, are making sure that we are passing on this history to our youngsters. Not only the history that is our Guyanese history, with many of them being born here, also the way in which it intersects with the American history and the diasporal history.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for the kind remarks and your very profound comment. And just to go back, I realized that I didn't fully address what Miss Fernandez said, and I think we all need to give Miss Fernandez a round of applause because she is working so hard in her personal time to um, lead the history club. And hearing what she had to say today about the curriculum, we can understand how much effort she has put into it to actually have 85 members in the history club, given the limited scope for that at St. Rose's. So thank you so much again, Miss Fernandez. You deserve, as the French say, a chapeau. And and I think this is part of the reason why, with together with three of my classmates, Michelle Goddard, Debbie Allen, and Gail Lee, why we decided to commit to funding history awards for the two different levels where there will be external examinations at the Caribbean level to sort of, promote history, let people understand that it's important. And and I hope that we have the opportunity to do a lot more. And maybe one day uh, we have to think about how to lobby the government to make some changes back to the way it was. Sometimes we need to go back in order to go forward, um, because we need to have more history. And I think one way that I would promote it to the policymakers in our dear land is that history can be a tool, an important instrument. They're talking about the One Guyana policy. I can think of no stronger instrument to promote the One Guyana policy than highlighting our shared history and culture and how we came together as one. So that's something that I think we need to look at for the future. Over.
Okay, I think
Okay,
we
I
have
think
time for
Chanel had her.
one more question from Shondell, and then we're gonna have to. That would be it.
Oh,
And
so
Susan.
thank you. Hello, Jennifer. Wonderful talk. Good to
Thank
see
you. Hello, learned professor. Let me let everybody know this is a learned
Oh
professor.
my God, please, please, let's tone it down. First, I have to thank the information from Ms. Branch. I did not know that history has become an optional subject. So I think I was one of the girls that started at Bishops and then went to QC when co-ed. So we were the inaugural group of girls at Queens College. And at that time, it was O levels, not the Caribbean exam. And so there were five compulsory subjects that everyone started with, history being one of them. It was history, geography, English literature, English language, and math. Everyone had to take those five and then your specialization on top of that. So history was not optional. And that's really a major change to have history being optional as foundational knowledge. So kudos to the is this Fernandez for making that extra effort to really get that into the curriculum. And then we fast forward to the diaspora, it's actually a lot of more work intentional as parents in the diaspora. I am not a parent myself, but I have friends who are parents and teaching students about their own history and Black history more generally within a society that is so racist overtly and covertly requires a lot of intentional work on the part of parents. That history has become kind of performative or even culture. So it's like we go to the festival, we go to that, and those things are fun. But the kind of stuff that you're talking about and really getting oral history from the ancestors requires that the parents, and we have two generations of parents now, like our age, we have another generation of parents that now are probably in their 40s and 50s, right, who might have left Guyana a long time ago and are spending most of their adult life here. So it requires then double the work for as generations change and we are removed from Guyana at a younger age, what is the knowledge we're passing on? We're not even there for those grandparents because they're gone. So there would need to be a lot of generational adjustment to pass on this knowledge living in the diasporic context when you or yourself are removed from Guyana from a generation that probably already lost that knowledge. Because now you have a generation where history is not even compulsory. So where is the starting point of knowledge to pass on, right? So I think it would be a big charge to parents in the diaspora to really seek out. And I agree with you linking it to African American history because, you know, we all got dragged on the boat across the notion. So I think it's just a comment for a stronger charge on parenting in the 21st century in the diaspora is a lot more work. And it has to be different now because information is now through social media. We'll have to communicate ways of that in ways that Gen Z can understand and connect with. So that's just my comment.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Desiree now.
No, Susan had a comment also.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for permitting me. Firstly, let me say thank you so much, Ms. Branch and others, for your support to our history program at school. We appreciate it a lot, and it has gone a very long way to encourage students to do well at history. However, as I told you in my comments, history is not across the board in Guyanese schools. And so, because of that, only the students who are opting to become maybe lawyers in the humanities or the arts stream, those are the only students who would actually choose the history to study. This thereby deprives the rest of the student population from actually engaging or learning about
Right.
history. Now, I try my very best because I know history is very important, and I would try to do practical activities for them. For example, in our department, social department, we try our utmost to engage them in every cultural holiday, whether it is of Indian, whatever they said, because it's history and we're looking at Caribbean history. However, whenever school is closed at a critical time when we could have, taught them so much during the Emancipation Festival, they don't come out. Many times I would invite them out, right? The history club students. I would let the parents know, I would let the students know what day to come out. Let us go and enjoy whatever's in the national park. Let us take some photos. Let us bring awareness and let us learn on the spot. Because as Ms. said, children live what they learn. So you don't just talk history, you don't just, give a lecture, but you have to show them, right? The practical aspect. I don't get the support when school is closed. I'm there, I'm calling, I'm texting, I'm telling them, 2 weeks in advance, I'm going to be in the national park. Come and meet me. I'm going to be by 1763 Monument. I'm going out places. I'm taking my children. I'm educating my biological children, inviting the students from the schools, and they're always making excuses simply because only those who are gravitating towards law, they would study history as a prerequisite. Otherwise than that, they're not finding it, necessary to learn about their ancestors or their past or anything. And it's very appalling. And the history is going to die if we don't keep the younger generation within the loop. And that's what I'm
Right.
trying to do. But it's like the parents too, as Ms. Brand said, the parents are not kind of doing their part. They're not seeing the importance. And that is very shocking because I teach my children, and my children, we're always engaged in something. We're going to some monument. We're always out doing something. And I can't understand the Guyanese parents. They're not encouraging their children to learn. And that's very sad. So that's my take on it. Thank you again for your support. And I did enjoy the gaff. My teacher that has just retired, Miss Carmichael, we would usually teach students folk songs, right? The song that you would have sang and so. And I'm so sad that she's gone. She's not coming back for September. And we would teach them the folk songs to try to keep it alive. We had a folk song competition. Very few students entered, which was very sad. And this was during February for our Black History Month celebrations. We had a competition. I had medals, I had trophies waiting, and I barely got one or two students, and I had to give them the prize automatically. So I'm really trying, and I'm not getting the support from the parents or the students. So that's my take.
Thank you, Susan. Our last question will be from Oren. Oren, can you unmute yourself?
You might have to unmute it.
Yeah, he did.
Greetings from Chicago in the American Midwest. Thanks for having me, Jennifer. So we're in a different time zone. Unfortunately, I missed the first part of it, but I'm glad to be here. I have just a small comment, and it pertains more to Guyanese in the diasporas and Guyanese at home. But from my standpoint, history and culture are lived activities. And what I propose is that you transmit history and culture in small ways. And I have found that food is a very important transmitter of history and culture. So I'm surrounded in many ways by fictive Guyanese, meaning that people who are not Guyanese by blood or marriage, but have been imbued with Guyanese culture through food. And, you know, we have special dishes. We have pepper pot, which I made for the first time this past Christmas. And several of my friends have declared their new favorite food. I have friends waiting on some pine because we got some pineapple yesterday, and I'm going to make use the skin to make pine. I routinely make sorrel for my friends. You know, we're not like Jamaica or Trinidad where you have a bunch of restaurants. Everyone knows about Jamaican patties, or they identify certain foods with Trinidad. We don't have a plethora of Guyanese restaurants outside of, let's say, Queens and Brooklyn. So we have to really identify what is unique about our culture and share it with our friends. It doesn't all have to be books that they read or historical figures. It can just simply be, you know, we make sorrel, we make pine, we make black pudding, we make, you know, sauce, we make pepper pot, just sharing our food, which is an activity increasingly lost on subsequent diasporic generations. So to Jennifer's point, how it begins in the home isn't necessarily simply by telling them about Walter Rodney or pick your historical figure, whether it's Jagan or Burnham, but by teaching them how to make these foods. You know, what distinguishes Guyanese patty from Jamaican beef patty? You know, we don't say ground beef, we say minced meat. You know, we by using the language that our forebears used and by simply conveying our culture through food. Sorry to be so long-winded. That's it.
Okay.
That's
Thank
fine.
you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really could relate to that. I work in a library, and the thing is, one time, you know, talking about that, I did, I think it was for Caribbean Heritage Month or something, and I did a presentation about Guyana, and I took pastries and stuff, and it was for a bunch, for kids. It was, I specifically did it for the children, and this little Jewish boy came up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, I was happy with all the stuff that you told me. Guyana sounds like a fun place. And then the food is even better. You should take," and he's telling me, "Oh, you should take this to other libraries. They would really love it." So I'm glad to hear that you say, you know, with people where they don't know about our, you know, food is part of our culture, to actually add that too.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you so very much, Jennifer. This was a very wonderful presentation, and we hope you can do something like this again for us. And thank you all. Our next presentation would be in September. We have not decided the topic as yet, so stay tuned. Okay, bye-bye.
Right.